Hello, welcome. Today we would start with Gauche-Lyon, the 10th chapter that talks about coastal landform. Before starting with the various landforms that are seen in the coastal area, we would talk about the waves. Now, whenever we talk about coast, wave is something that is indispensable and we need to understand the characteristics of wave in order to understand how and why certain landforms are formed. So, this is an example of classic wave. The uppermost section of the wave we call that as crest, and the lowermost section we say it is a trough. The distance between the crest and the trough is known as the height of the wave. If we take it from the center, we can say this is the amplitude of the wave, and the difference between the two crests is known as wavelength. Now these are some of the common terms that you must be familiar with, and this would be helpful when we would understand the further topics on the coastal landforms and the waves. Now we have the various patterns of the waves that are seen. So the amplitude of the waves differ in all these four different types of waves that we can see here. Now if we have a particle that is lying on the top of the water and you have a wave that is flowing, this would be the kind of movement of the particle that could be seen, and these wave particles have a kind of movement that could be seen in this fashion. Similarly, you have one very interesting diagram that shows the movement of sand particles in the direction of the wave. Now when we talk about the direction of the wave, we talk about swash and back swash. Swash is basically the movement of the particles towards the coastal area, and when it is moving back we call it as backwash. So you have swash that moves towards the coast, and then you have backwash that takes it away from the coast. Similarly, if there is any undercurrent that is formed, we say it is known as undertow. And those waves which strike the coast are known as the breaking waves or the breakers. So these are some of the common waves that we talk about. Now this was something that we had discussed about the characteristics of wave. Coming on to the basic chapter on the coastal landforms that we need to understand today. For this, we would say that these coastal features are governed by certain important characteristics. Those are waves, tides and currents. We have covered waves, tides and currents in a separate lecture, so you can refer that, and even the various landforms of the coastal features are covered in pretty detail in this video, so you can again go through that for more details. Coming on to the today's lecture, we would talk about the mechanism of wave erosion. Now this mechanism of wave erosion is governed by the various waves. Waves can get higher and swifter, and they can get smaller and slower. So those are the kind of movement of the waves as we saw in those diagrams, and we have talked about the various characteristics of the wave. We have also discussed what is a swash and what is a backwash, and then the undertow current, which is a kind of offshore drift which moves towards the bottom away from the shore. So those are the common terms that we have discussed about the waves. Now coming on to how these wave landforms are formed. So there are few major things that we understand here. Similar to what we have seen in the karst topography, in the riverine topography, we see here also there is a phenomena of attrition where two particles collide among themselves. Then you have corrosion where you have the particle that collides with the surface. So it could be beach, it could be the coastline. Then you have definitely, since it's water, you have hydraulic action. So dissolving or wave splash leads to water retreat or the retreat of the waves, and you have the expansion that takes place, and sometimes you have small joints that are created in the caves, and through that joints you have the water or the waves or the air that ultimately passes through. So we would see this in a while when we will talk about geos and gallops in the further section. Finally, definitely if it's a kind of limestone topography, you have a solvent action that takes place and the dissolution of material takes place. So those are the four basic features. Now what are the features that affect the rate of erosion? When we talk about rate of erosion, those rate of erosion are governed by certain characteristics. Firstly, it's the nature of the rock that we understand, the amount of the rock it is exposed to, the effect of the tides, the effect of the current, the undercurrent that is coming through, and definitely human interference. So those are some of the classic characteristics that we talk about that affects the amount or the rate of erosion of any landform, mainly the coastal landform for now. Coming on to the erosional features. So, as we have seen for other landforms, we would be talking about firstly the erosional features, then the depositional features, and today we would also be focusing on the coastline of submergence and emergence, which is a very important section under coastal landforms. So, first coming on to the erosional landforms, you have the capes and the bays. Now, capes and the bays, as you can see, most of those are commonly seen in the region of the Dalston Head and the England region, where you have the Swang Bay. So, what happens, similarly to that, you have the Penang Island, where you have the various capes and bays that are seen. So, this is a classic example of a cape and a bay. So, you have a kind of landform that is seen, and you have small cap that comes up and a depression where you have water that enters. This water is known as the bay, and the region where it comes out as a landmass is known as a cape. So, this region is the cape, and where you have water accumulation we call it as bay. The next important is cliffs and wave cut platform. Typically towards the west of the American coastline, here this side, towards the Oregon coast and the Californian coast, where you have the Highway 101 that runs, you have basically a kind of cliffed coastline that is seen. So, what is a difference between a cliffed coastline and a beach? So, beach are a result of depositional activities of waves. So, there would be several examples where you have beaches and you would have sand that would be seen. On the other hand, you have the rocks, those are cut directly, and you have steep features, those are seen, and these steep features are known as cliffs. Across the cliff, you would have a kind of platform that would run, and that platform would be known as a wave cut platform. So, cliffs and wave cut platform usually run together. Good examples are the regions of English Channel that you can see. Then you have the west coast of America that you can see. Then you have the west of Norway, where you have the various coastline which is having a kind of wave cut platform which is commonly seen. So, those areas are the common areas where you have wave cut wave cut platform that is seen, and this is a classic demonstration that could quickly help you understand a kind of topography where you would have a very steep cliff that could be seen, and after a cliff you would have a flat region, and this region would be known as a wave cut platform, and finally you would have the coast or the sea that would be seen, or the ocean that would be seen. Now, within the ocean you have various formations. First of all, what happens, let's consider this to be a rock, and from this rock you have water that constantly goes through. So, when water is constantly going through it, it is creating a kind of small hole, and that hole would be known as cave. So, cave would be closed on one side, so it would be closed on one side but open on this side, and you would have a opening that would be formed. If this opening goes through and through and you have the movement across, we call it as arch. When the arch and the top of the rock gets narrower and this region collapses out, you have a stack that remains. When the level of stack goes below the sea level, we call it as a stump. So, you have the formation of cave, arch, stack and stump that goes in a sequence. Now, these are commonly seen again in the areas of England where you have Orkneys and Needles. So, you have the topmost region which is the Scotland, and from the Scotland on the top side you have the region of Orkney Islands which is part of Scotland, where you have commonly the formations of arch, stacks and stumps that is seen. Similarly, you have the island of Hebrides in Scotland again, where you have commonly seen arches and stacks. The next is geos and gullops. Very interesting feature very interesting to understand, and if you understand it carefully once, you will never forget it. So you have a diagram here. Now visualize this diagram in a kind of 3D fashion and you would understand. You have the water on the lower surface, you have this rock, and within this rock you have a kind of hole that is created. Now this hole has an opening towards the top surface. What happens is, when you have a sudden gush of wave or a tide coming in, high tide coming in, water enters this hole in the rock at a very high speed and comes out of this top small hole that is seen in a kind of fountain. This creates a kind of whistling sound which is known as gullop. This opening is known as geos, commonly seen in the areas of Scotland, again in the Britain area. So you have these gullops and geos which are commonly seen. Very interesting phenomena. Water is trapped inside, and when you have a sudden gush of water that flows out in a fashion of fountain, you have a whistling sound that occurs, and therefore it is also known as blowhole or gullop. The gullop means gurgling sound. The next is depositional features. So depositional features, commonly, as we said, beaches are the most common depositional features that you have heard about, and this is something that most of you would have ever witnessed or seen. Now what happens is, when you have a beach line deposition, you can say when it is closer to the sea, the depositions are smaller and fine. Away from the sea, the depositions are much coarse and much thicker in size as compared to towards the sea. So those are a classic characteristics of understanding the beaches. Then you have the silt and the mud depositions. Those are seen in the shallow waters. The next important thing for your depositional features is spit and bars. Now what happens in a spit is, you have a coastline and you have a kind of small hook that is seen which is known as spit. And when this spit forms a kind of parallel bar, it is known as bar, and it's commonly seen in the region of Dorset in England. So again, the regions of England, you have lots of spits and bars. Those are commonly seen here. That is a common example of depositional landform, and you have numerous formations that are seen. Again, when you have the mainland and a small island, and if you have a piece of deposition that connects these two, we call it as Tambolo. So Tambolo is again an important feature commonly seen in the regions of Poland, and you have the Baltic region and the regions of Germany. So this region you would have lots of Tambolos, those would be visualized. The next important feature that we see here are marine dunes and dune belts. Those are seen across France, Belgium, Denmark. So those are the areas where you have marine dunes and dune belts, those are seen. And to arrest the expansion of dunes in these areas, a grass is grown, and that grass is known as marram grass, and also pine trees are planted in those areas. This is again very important. The next important thing that we would talk today is coastline of submergence and coastline of emergence. Now much of it is clear itself from the name. So you understand this with the name itself. So sometimes you have submergence that takes place. Now what is submergence? Submergence means, this is an example to demonstrate submergence and this is an example to demonstrate emergence. Let's first talk about submergence. Under submergence, what would happen? After the glacial period or the ice age, you had an increase in the level of waters. So you had the rise in the level of waters, and because of the rise in the level of waters, you had the land mass that subsided below the water, and therefore we call it a coastline of submergence. On the other hand, you have a coastline of emergence. What happened during the coastline of emergence? You had the land that rise above the ground and you had water that subsided down, and therefore you had coastline of emergence, those were formed. So we would understand the examples from global perspective considering the coastline of submergence and emergence. First of all, we would focus on coastline of submergence. As we said, this occurred during the period where you had the rise in the sea level and submergence of the land. There were 4 different types of submergence coastlines, those were formed. The first is Ria, Froid, Dalmatian and estuarine. So those are the 4 different types of coastline we would discuss today. The first is the Rhea coastline. Now Rhea coastline classically happened during the period of Ice Age. You had water levels after the Ice Age that took place. So rise in the water level, submergence of the land that took place, and in the case of Rhea coastline, what classically happens is you have a mountain range and that mountain range is perpendicular to the sea level. As a result, you have a transverse or a discordant coastline that is seen, which is right angle to the sea level. That's very important. Commonly seen in the areas of Atlantic region, and you have the North France area, Northwest France, where you have the Rhea coastline. Then you have the regions of Devon, Cornwall in UK, where you have the Rhea coastline that is seen. Again, this coastline is backed mainly by the commercial ports, and therefore what happens is in this area you would have numerous commercial ports. Those would be seen and those would be sheltered. Now these areas are also used as fishing ports. So this is an example of a Rhea coastline. The nearby landforms, as you can see, are not that steep. Next comes the Fryed coastline. Fryed coastline is the submergent U-shaped glacial trough. So if you look onto the picture here, you would have a very good idea of a difference between a Rhea coastline and a Fryed coastline. In a Fryed coastline, you can see very high mountain ranges on either side. Then you have fishing and marketing centers. Those are commonly seen in the areas of Norway. Then you have the regions of Alaska, where you have the Fryed coastline that is commonly seen. Now you have small shallow sections that are seen here. The walls are very steep, formed by glaciation action, and it's a kind of submergent U-shaped trough that is formed. Since it is backed by mountains on either sides, the accessibility is poor and you do not have that good number of ports as seen in the Rhea coastline. Again, in this area, due to high rate of erosion, the Fryads become very deep and they run onto long distances on a kind of very deep fashion. The next is Dalmatian coastline. Dalmatian coastline is again very interesting. As you can see, this is the region of Italy. Below Italy and above Africa, you have Mediterranean Sea. On the left side of Italy, if I mark, it is the Ligurian Sea, and between Italy and the remaining of Europe, you have this region, and this region is known as Adriatic Sea. So the region close to the Adriatic Sea, that is Yugoslavia, and the regions of Adriatic Sea, the other countries close to that, have a classic Dalmatian coastline. Under a Dalmatian coastline, what happens is you have longitudinal coast that is present. Again, this would be very clear from this diagram. So you have the coastline, and parallel to the coastline you have longitudinal islands that could be seen, and therefore we call it as a Dalmatian coastline. Now this is also common in the Pacific coast. Also north and south of South America, you have the Dalmatian coast that is seen here, also seen in the region of San Francisco in California. So these are the regions where you have Dalmatian coastline, runs parallel or concordant, and it is longitudinal in nature. The next is the estuarine coastline. Estuarine coastline is seen in the regions of London, Buenos Aires in South America, then you have Hamburg. Now what happens during the estuarine coastline? It is basically submerged lowland that is seen, and it is a funnel shaped estuary that is seen, and since it's a kind of funnel shaped estuary, the entrance is usually not silted. If it is silted, it acts as a blockage and you do not have ports that could be seen along a estuarine coastline. The next important classification that we talk about is coastline of emergence. Under coastline of emergence, as we saw, there was either a fall in the sea level that was witnessed or a upliftment of land. Now in either of these cases, you had two landforms that were formed. The first was the uplifted lowland or the emergent upland. So one was a kind of very low in elevation, the other was higher in elevation. These coastline of emergence are less common as compared to coastline of submergence. Now coming on to the coastline of emergence, you have two, as we said. First is the uplifted lowland coast. Now these uplifted lowland coast are usually smoother, more gentle, you have shallow waters that are seen, and the region is much more sandy, and you have small gravels, those are seen. Now where on the world map can we locate the lowland emergent, the lowland topographies? So lowland topographies can be seen in the southwest of America, in the region between the West Finland and East Sweden. So these areas, you have these areas where you have emergent, the coastline of emergence, the lowland coast that are seen. Similarly, you have the south region of Argentina where you have the Rio de Plata that is seen. The next is emergent upland. Now emergent upland is further less common. It's mainly due to the faulting action that is seen, commonly seen in the region of Scotland in Europe, in UK. And then you have the coastline of Deccan where you have the emergent upland coastline that is seen, and the region of Red Sea. So you have the Mediterranean Sea here, and Mediterranean Sea is connected by Suez Canal to this region which is known as Red Sea. Close to the Arabia, and in the Red Sea you have the west coast of Arabia, and this west coast of Arabia you have the emergent upland coastline. So those are the two categories under coastline of emergence. So with this we cover the 10th chapter of Gochujang. We will be covering the further remaining chapters of Gochujang in the upcoming classes. So stay tuned. If you have any doubts, feel free to ask those as comment, and do subscribe. Have a very good day ahead.